On August 15th, 2026, President Trump told a crowd of law enforcement officers in New York that he would soon declare the Strait of Hormuz, a stretch of water between Iran and Oman, a territory of the United States.
Blockade. No ships get through unless we want them to. Pretty soon I'll be declaring the Hormuz Strait a territory of the United States.
He said it with a chuckle. Even the reporter standing next to him noted that. But here's the thing. The U.S. doesn't have jurisdiction over that water. It never has. What the U.S. has is a blockade. We have the blockade. No ships get through unless we want them to. That's not a legal claim. That's a military fact. And it's the only part of this whole story that's actually true. This is a story about what happens when the only tool you have is the ability to keep something closed, and what gets built around that fact while everyone waits for someone else to blink first. Let's get into it.
Start with a ship. The USS Abraham Lincoln left San Diego in November 2025, expecting a routine 7-month Pacific deployment. By August 2026, it had been at sea 265 days, a modern-day record for consecutive days without a port call. The crew ran out of soap, toothpaste, hot water for weeks at a time, meals reduced at points to half a cup of rice and 2 tortillas. Family members told reporters about moldy showers and broken toilets. Then it got worse. A sailor went overboard in early August, rescued within the hour, but the Navy itself called it a mental health episode. Family members described texts from their sailors. He hopes he doesn't wake up tomorrow. He and his shipmates constantly think about jumping off the ship just for relief. The Navy's official position: no increase in suicidal ideation. They declined to release the data. Why couldn't they just bring the ship home? Because there wasn't another carrier to send. Not really. In a closed-door meeting with military families on August 6th, the acting Navy secretary told them the George Washington, the fleet's only forward-deployed carrier based in Japan, wasn't an option because the U.S. needed it to maintain a presence in the Pacific against China. The actual plan was to send a different ship, the Theodore Roosevelt. Then the story broke publicly. Families talked to reporters, lawmakers got involved, and within days, the plan changed. The George Washington got redirected after all, leaving the Pacific without a U.S. carrier for an unknown period of time. That's the first thing worth understanding before we talk about territory. The United States does not currently have enough aircraft carriers to hold its position in the Middle East and deter China in the Pacific at the same time. Both the Lincoln and the Gerald R. Ford before it got stretched past their planned deployments because there was nowhere else to pull a relief ship from. The fix, when it finally came, arrived because of public pressure, not because the Pentagon had a plan. Keep that in your head. It matters for what comes next.
The Strait of Hormuz sits between Iran's coast and Oman's. About a fifth of the world's oil and a fifth of its LNG used to move through it every day. Since the U.S. and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury against Iran on February 28, 2026, that traffic has slowed to a trickle. Iran calls it a closure. The U.S. calls it a blockade. Functionally, they're describing the same wall from opposite sides. Here's the part that matters for the title claim. A blockade is a denial tool. It's good at stopping things. It requires ships and threats and presence. Brute force, basically. What it cannot do, on its own, is guarantee anything gets through safely, and the record backs that up. Even with the blockade running, tankers have still been hit. So when Trump says, essentially, we already control it, what he's really describing is the ability to stop traffic, not the ability to guarantee it. Those are different capabilities, and only one of them currently exists. Declaring the strait territory doesn't change that gap. It just puts a name on the blockade that's already there. And a blockade, unlike a legal claim, doesn't have an expiration date. It just continues for as long as somebody keeps paying to run it, which raises the obvious question: who's actually paying and who's cashing in?
The official answer to how do we get out from under this is build around it. There's a real active plan reported with sourcing back to Israel's own energy minister and Prime Minister Netanyahu to route Gulf oil around Hormuz entirely. A proposed $5 billion refinery and export hub outside the strait, overland pipelines across Saudi Arabia to Israel's port of Haifa, It folds into a bigger, older idea called the India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor, revived now that the war gave it new urgency. 7 pipelines total are under construction or in planning across the region right now. Goldman Sachs estimates regional bypass capacity could hit 14 million barrels a day by the end of 2028. Sounds like a solution. Here's the hole in it. Even at full build-out, existing and planned pipelines cap out around 9 million barrels a day. The strait normally carries closer to 20, and pipelines only move liquid new oil and, to a lesser extent, gas. They cannot move a container ship. They cannot move LNG at anywhere near the volume tankers do. Almost 20% of the entire world's LNG trade moves through Hormuz, and there is no pipe on Earth built to replace that. So the honest read isn't the bypass solves it. It's the bypass insulates a fraction of one commodity, while leaving the rest of global trade exactly as exposed as it's always been, which means the blockade and everything it costs doesn't go away once the pipelines finish. It just gets a little easier to live with for the people who aren't relying on what the pipes can't carry.
Global modeling puts GDP at risk for a prolonged closure somewhere between $3.5 and $7 trillion. That's a global number. It doesn't land evenly. Saudi Arabia and Oman have pipeline alternatives. They'll be fine. The U.S. absorbs it at higher gas prices and political headache. Not comfortable, but survivable. The countries actually exposed are the ones with no vote in any of this. Japan imports 95% of its crude from the Middle East, South Korea close to 70%. Both are running on a few weeks of reserve, watching their stock markets drop double digits since the war started. Jordan and Lebanon are almost entirely dependent on Gulf crude for both fuel and food, because Gulf gas feeds the fertilizer that grows the region's food supply. And then there's Russia. A war fought to pressure Iran ended up handing Moscow a revenue windfall. Russia export earnings nearly doubled in a single month when Hormuz traffic collapsed, because Russian crude became the closest available substitute. India needed it so badly that the U.S. had to waive its own Russia sanctions just to keep India's energy supply from collapsing. The Iran war forced Washington to ease pressure on Russia, in the middle of a completely separate war where Ukraine is trying to choke off that same Russian oil revenue with drone strikes. Strikes the U.S. has reportedly asked Ukraine to pull back on. Everybody in this is protecting a different piece of the same board. Nobody's protecting the board.
Here's where it stops looking like drift and starts looking like design. While the blockade holds, the U.S. has locked in 2 enormous energy commitments from allies using leverage, not market demand. The EU, $750 billion in U.S. oil, LNG, and nuclear energy purchases through 2028 tied to a tariff deal. Current EU purchases from the U.S. don't come close to a third of that annual target. Sitting members of the European Parliament are calling it politically coerced. A letter signed by over 20 of them warns it exposes the EU to what they call political blackmail. Japan, $550 billion in U.S. energy and infrastructure investment, plus a separate $56 billion purchase package tied to the same tariff leverage playbook. Some Japanese analysts have called the profit structure of these deals extremely unequal. Neither government negotiated these from a position of market choice. They negotiated them under tariff threats, with the U.S. selecting which projects got funded. And right now, in 2026, the U.S. doesn't even have the spare export capacity to deliver on both at once. Cargoes are already getting pulled away from Europe toward higher-paying Asian buyers in real time. So what happens next? If a contested Hormuz keeps a major competitor like Qatar off the market and prices climb, the deals that looked expensive on the day they were signed start looking, in hindsight, like the only option anyone had. Nobody needed to keep the strait closed to make these deals happen, but a closed strait sure makes them easier to defend.
And here's one more thread, because it closes the loop. In early August 2026, France cut output from over 1/2 of its nuclear fleet because of heat. That single event cascaded across the continent. Italian and German power prices hit 3.5-year highs. Southeastern European countries moved to formal rationing. Moldova had to tap emergency reserves. Europe's heat waves have killed tens of thousands of people in recent summers. On that same day, the grid buckled. Reporting noted power prices were compounded by a risk premium tied directly to the Iran conflict. The war doesn't cut off Europe's power. But it adds a price tag to the exact moment vulnerable people are dying from heat and grids are being rationed. An unresolved war on another continent adding cost to a life or death problem it has nothing to do with. Because everything in the system is now priced together.
What's in it for us? Fair question, and it deserves a real answer instead of a dismissal. Doesn't some of this come back to us? Some of it does. Genuinely. The Golden Pass LNG project alone, one of 8 operating terminals, is projected to generate about $34 billion in U.S. economic gains and $5 billion in tax revenue over its life. Industry-wide LNG infrastructure has drawn over $200 billion in investment. But look at the shape of that benefit before you bank on it. Golden Pass's own numbers, roughly 19,000 construction jobs over 5 years, peaking near 7,000 at once. Once built, about 5,200 permanent direct and indirect jobs for the life of the facility. That's construction employment outnumbering permanent employment by 3 or 4 to 1, a 5-year surge concentrated in a handful of Gulf Coast counties, not a lasting national jobs engine. And that infrastructure spending is private capital, Chevron, Venture Global, Cheniere, and their shareholders investing their own money, expecting to profit for decades. It was never sized to offset anything. It's not in the same category as what the public is paying, because here's the actual split, and it's the whole point of this video. The cost is public and it's involuntary. The carrier deployments, the blockade, the extended combat zone rotations that put sailors like the Lincoln's crew through 265 days at sea with no fixed end date. That's taxpayer money, committed by decisions nobody voted on directly, with no price cap, because nobody can put a dollar figure on keep it running until further notice. The benefit is private and it's captured. The $200 billion in terminal investment belongs to energy companies and their shareholders. The $18 billion in state revenue from Israel's Leviathan gas deal goes to the Israeli treasury, not to the Egyptians who died of heat stroke the last 2 summers that same gas field went offline. The $750 billion the EU pledged, the $550 billion plus Japan pledged. That's foreign capital locked into contracts with a handful of American producers. The workers get a temporary paycheck during the build. The companies get the deed. That's not a trade. That's the public underwriting a private return with jobs and energy dominance as the story that makes the arrangement easy to defend to the people actually paying for it.
The blockade can't guarantee anyone safe passage. It never claimed to. All it can do is keep the door shut. And declaring it territory doesn't change that. It just puts a flag on the door. While it stays shut, a carrier crew burns 265 days at sea. Pipelines get built that can carry a fraction of what it actually need. Allies sign $100 billion energy commitments under tariff threats that they can't yet be delivered on. Russia gets richer off a war it isn't fighting. People dying in a heat wave in Europe pay a war premium on their electricity bill for a conflict that has nothing to do with them. And at home, the cost is public and forced, while the benefit is private and captured, with just enough trickling down to make the arrangement look like a trade instead of what it actually is. Now I know what you're thinking. What about the nukes? That's a good question. I guess the answer is that it must not be as important as they made it out to be. I'm not going to tell you how this ends because right now nobody involved seems to know either. Maybe the economic windfall will be worth the cost, maybe it won't. But if you think this is the only theater where the American taxpayer is ponying up with a debatable benefit to us, you're sadly mistaken. Since January 2025, the same government has taken ownership stakes, actual equity, not contracts, not grants, in more than 30 private companies. A golden share in U.S. Steel, 15% of MP Materials, making the Pentagon its largest shareholder, nearly 10% of Intel, a stake now worth over $40 billion. Lithium Americas, Westinghouse, a rocket motor unit inside L3 Harris, $27 billion, taxpayer-funded, spread across 4 different agencies. So stay tuned for my next episode because I'm going to do a deep dive into it, and I'd advise you to brace yourself because this clown car doesn't have brakes. Anyway, I want to know where you think this is headed. Let me know down in the comments, and I will catch you in the next one.